There is a bottle in your fridge that has been lying to you your whole life. Ketchup. The most American thing on the table, right up there with baseball caps and drive-thrus. Except ketchup is not American. It is not even Western. For most of its 300-year history, it contained no tomatoes at all. And for one strange decade in the 1800s, it was not food. It was medicine, rolled into pills and sold by doctors. By the end of this story, you will never look at that bottle the same way again. The trail starts on the coast of southeastern China, centuries ago. Fishermen and traders there kept a pungent, salty sauce made from fermented fish, a cousin of the fish sauces still splashed over food across Vietnam and Thailand today. In the Hokkien language spoken around Fujian, one name for this kind of brew was ke-tsiap. Say it out loud. That sharp little word crossed oceans, mangled by sailor after sailor, and landed in English as ketchup. British traders met the sauce in the ports of Southeast Asia in the late 1600s and did what the British did with everything they liked abroad. They took it home. One early English recipe, printed in 1732, even credits its origin to the East Indies. There was just one problem. Nothing in a damp English pantry could reproduce a tropical fermented fish sauce. So cooks improvised with what they had. And for the next 100 years, ketchup meant something completely different. Mushroom ketchup, walnut ketchup, oyster ketchup, anchovy ketchup. A whole family of dark, savory, salty liquids that a Georgian cook would shake into stews the way we use Worcestershire sauce now. When a novel from that era mentions ketchup, picture a thin brown mushroom brew in a corked bottle, not one tomato in sight. If you handed a modern bottle of Heinz to an English cook in 1780, she would not recognize the name on the label as the same substance. The tomato only muscled its way in at the very end of the story, and it had to fight for the job. Europe had spent 2 centuries treating tomatoes with suspicion, as we told in our episode on the fruit everyone feared. America was friendlier ground. In 1812, a Philadelphia scientist and horticulturist named James Mees published what is considered the first tomato ketchup recipe, praising the fruit he called the love apple. His version would still surprise you, spiked with brandy and lacking the sugar and vinegar wall of acidity we expect. But the idea caught on, because crushed tomatoes gave the sauce body and a bright taste that mushrooms never could. Farm wives began bottling tomato ketchup at the end of each harvest, and American ketchup slowly turned red. Then, just as the tomato version was finding its feet, ketchup's story took its strangest turn. In 1834, an Ohio physician named John Cook Bennett stood up in front of a medical college and announced that the tomato was not merely food. It was, he claimed, a cure. Diarrhea, indigestion, bilious attacks, jaundice, rheumatism. Bennett pinned them all on a diet lacking tomatoes and prescribed the fruit as the remedy. Newspapers reprinted his lectures across the country, and because fresh tomatoes were seasonal but medicine sells year-round, the obvious product followed within a year: the tomato pill. Concentrated extract of tomato pressed into pills, promising the healing power of ketchup in convenient form. Bear in mind what this means. A generation before anyone squeezed ketchup onto a hamburger, Americans were swallowing it at the pharmacy on doctors' orders, as seriously as we take vitamins today. The condiment aisle and the medicine cabinet were, for one strange decade, the same shelf. The tomato pill business boomed, and then it did what booms do. Competing salesmen went to war, each accusing the other of selling fakes, each claiming the only genuine extract of tomato. They were both closer to the truth than they knew. Chemists who examined the pills found that many contained little or no tomato at all. Some were just ordinary laxatives with a fashionable label. By 1850, the scandals had piled up, the medical claims had collapsed, and the tomato pill vanished from the shelves. The fad left one lasting gift behind. It had spent 15 years telling every American that tomatoes were good for you, and demand for tomato ketchup kept climbing long after the pills were forgotten. That demand dragged ketchup into its darkest chapter. Ketchup is a harvest product. Tomatoes ripen for a few weeks, and the sauce must last all year. And in the mid-1800s, the only ways to stretch it were ugly. Commercial makers boiled up tomato skins, cores, and factory scraps, packed the bottles with harsh preservatives like boric acid and salicylic acid, and when the result turned a sad, brownish yellow, they dyed it red. The dye of choice was coal tar. This was not a fringe practice. When an analysis in 1896 examined commercial ketchups, about 90% were found to contain ingredients labeled injurious to health. The bottle on the average table was, quite literally, a low dose of industrial chemistry in a pretty color, which is exactly the door Henry J. Heinz walked through. Heinz had started out in Pittsburgh selling horseradish, and his first masterstroke had nothing to do with recipes. He sold it in clear glass. Every competitor used opaque bottles that hid the turnip filler and the floating leaves. Heinz let the customer see. When he launched his ketchup in 1876, he carried the same idea with him, though even Heinz needed decades to fully escape the era's chemistry, using the standard preservatives while his team hunted for something better. The breakthrough came in 1904, when his chief food scientist worked out a recipe that needed no preservatives at all. Riper tomatoes, more vinegar, more sugar. Thicker, sweeter, tangier. That recipe is why ketchup tastes the way it does today, a flavor born not in a kitchen, but in a fight against food fraud. By 1906, Heinz was shipping 5 million bottles of preservative-free ketchup a year, and he did something almost unheard of for a food tycoon. He sided with the regulators. Heinz lobbied for the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, the law that outlawed adulterated food, knowing it would wipe out the coal tar competition overnight. It did. Even his famous slogan is part of the mischief. The 57 in Heinz 57 Varieties was never a count of anything. By the time he coined it, the company already made more than 60 products. As Heinz himself told the story, he saw an advert on a New York train boasting 21 styles of shoes and simply liked how a number sounded, so he picked 57 because it felt lucky. One of the most trusted numbers in food history is, by the founder's own cheerful admission, made up. So take stock of the journey inside that bottle. A fermented fish sauce from the South China Sea, renamed by sailors, rebuilt from mushrooms in English kitchens, painted red by an American love apple, swallowed as medicine, poisoned by fraudsters, and finally redeemed by a Pittsburgh horseradish salesman with a clear glass bottle and a grudge against cheaters. All of that history sitting in your fridge door, waiting for fries. Every food has an origin story. This is Foodling.